Hello, and welcome back to our discussion of the Candrapradīpasamādhi Sūtra, where we continue a discussion which introduces you to the Chinese version of what's often referred to by the Sanskrit title, the Samādhi Raja Sutra. And in this video, we're going to continue from where we left off last time, and we're going to start diving into the contents of the version of the Samādhi Raja Sutra, which was translated by Narendra Yashas. So some notes of aspect that I want to note regarding the sutra. The overall structure appears complex, but it's actually, I believe it's actually systematic. And I think that we can analyze it as being systematically organized. It's also worth noting that it's philosophically dense. So it might be a little bit hard to understand at first, but we'll try to work our way through it. And also, it's a very rich repository of what we could call bodhisattva yana narrative, so the path of the bodhisattva. And so this refers particularly to past life narratives of bodhisattvas and narratives of bodhisattvas' great deeds in practicing on the path. So we'll cover each of these aspects in this video. So how to read the Candraprabha my translation of the sutra was completed couple of years ago, and then it was published in 2026 by Dharmakaya Books under a Creative Commons license. And it also contains, the volume also contains translations of the other recensions or the other versions of the sutra, which we covered in the previous video. And there's an introduction to each and a chapter by chapter study. And in the study, I also consulted the Tibetan commentary, which is translated from the Sanskrit of Manjushri Kirti. Murakami Shinkan's translation from the Chinese appeared the same year with BDK America on a different translation philosophy, and the two are useful to read in parallel. I'm not going to go into his translation choices or how he translated, because that's beyond what I plan to do here today. But if you have any questions, you can email me on that. And then, while most scholarship of the sutra has dealt with editing the Sanskrit and philology, the text is entirely readable as is in both Chinese and Tibetan. So the reason why people focus on the Sanskrit a lot, and I mentioned this, I got into this a little bit at the end of the previous video, is because the Sanskrit is somewhat fragmentary and there are various different versions of the Sanskrit. And so trying to figure out what the correct version or the correct way of reading it is has been a big concern for people reading the Sanskrit. However, in terms of the Chinese, it's completely readable as it is. And so I tried to show that by translating it. Moreover, the content, except for a few expanded prose sections, is fundamentally the same between the Chinese and Tibetan. So the Chinese refers to the third recension that we talked about, the first recension that we talked about last time. And then the Tibetan refers to the third recension that we talked about last time. So these are two different recensions, but roughly speaking, they're the same. Or rather, the Chinese is rather closer to the second recension. And the content, is fundamentally the same. And so in this respect, one can either be a philology person or an idea person regarding the text. In the previous video, we did more of the philology person approach, and today we'll be doing more of an idea approach. In terms of dividing the sutra into readable chunks, one can easily impose the chapter divisions of Recension 3, which match the contents fairly naturally. And this makes it easier to see the differences between recensions 1 and 3. The Chinese is what I call recension 1 rather than 2. So this is also suggested by the editors of the Taisho edition, who put the Sanskrit titles in the footnotes. Now, I actually followed the titles as they appear in the Tibetan recension. And that's because the Tibetan translation has had greater impact long run. There are more materials on the Tibetan version. I mentioned the commentary by Trenggu Rinpoche, and there's also the commentary by Manjushri Kirti, and also the translation in the 84,000 series. So I found it to be more it made more sense to use the divisions as they appear in the Tibetan version rather than in the Taisho. But in any case, one should bear in mind that these chapter titles and divisions are actually later impositions, right? So originally the sutra doesn't seem to have had any chapter divisions. So how do the chapters line up if we do divide them into chapters? So Pascal 1 to 10, you can see here, together with the chapters that they align with. Okay. So then in terms of the structure of the sutra, the text is complex, but well structured, in my opinion. Gomez and Silk suggested the structure for the text, but I developed a slightly different one based to an extent on the commentaries by Manjushri Kirti and Trengpa Rinpoche. I found it worked to create a somewhat classical structure as found in many commentaries. So you can see this kind of three-part structure in many Chinese commentaries. So we have an introductory section, chapter 1, the main doctrinal section, chapters 2 to 39, and then the propagation section, chapter 40. So let's cover these three in order. So the introductory section. In this section, we see the Buddha on Vulture Peak with a great assembly of monastics and bodhisattvas. And the Buddha is requested to give guidance on the bodhisattva path by a bodhisattva called Candraprabha Bodhisattva. Now, Murakami translates the sutra by his name. He says Prince Candraprabha Bodhisattva, but there's nothing to indicate that he's a prince in this sutra. So we just see him referred to by the term youth, doji, or Candraprabha Bodhisattva in the sutra. And this request to give guidance on the bodhisattva path reveals the purpose of the sutra, which the Buddha teaches is to maintain an equanimous mind, so a mind of evenness, balanced mind, and to achieve what's called the Samādhi of the equality and non-discrimination of all dharmas, so all phenomena. And so this Samādhi encompasses all elements of the path to awakening. And so for more details on what Samādhi means, see the first video. But basically what we see here is that Samādhi is not just a meditative state, but Samādhi is an encompassment of all of the qualities of the path to awakening. It's all of the qualities of a Buddha. And it's the attainment that one has to fulfill in order to become a Buddha. So that is to attain the equality and non-discrimination of all dharmas. So it's a very profound kind of way of experiencing the world. So the main doctrinal section can be divided into 4 steps of teaching. The first is teachings on preliminary or preparatory practices for achieving the Samādhi. So preliminaries, how to build up the foundations for practice. Okay, and this is something that both Trengpa Rinpoche and Manjushri Kirti note, that the sutra starts off with these basics, these foundations. And then the preliminary superior attainments that come from those preparatory practices in chapters 7 to 9. And then in part 3, Candraprabha's invitation to have the Samādhi taught and what its benefits will be are in chapters 10 to 16. So previewing what the results of achieving the Samādhi after you fulfill all of the superior attainments of the preliminaries, what its benefits will be. And then the core teaching section is actually part 4, which is about the Samādhi itself. So that comprises chapters 17 to 39. So let's first have a look at part 1, teachings on preliminary or preparatory practices for achieving the Samādhi. So this section has 5 subdivisions. The first is making offerings to accumulate merit. So we see this in many explanations of the Bodhisattva path, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, in Lam Rim instructions, of how to practice the Bodhisattva path, graded stages on the path. So in this section, the chapter on Sailendra Raja, once Shakyamuni Buddha as King Bhīṣma venerated Buddhas on Vulture's Peak for countless kalpas, hearing the sutra from each of them. The last Buddha was called Sailendra Raja. Serving the Buddhas by making offerings is an essential preliminary to practicing the path. So this is the preliminary on the path, making offerings to the Buddhas. So this is something that a Buddhist might do at their home shrine, at their butsudan, or their home altar, making offerings of incense, flowers, food, etc. To the Buddhas. This helps to accumulate the merit that you need as a foundation for progressing on the path. The second stage is to cultivate faith in the Buddha and devotion to practice. So you have to have faith, you have to have devotion. This is called, in Sanskrit, Śraddhā, and also Prasāda. So in the chapter Praise of the Buddha's Qualities, the qualities of the Buddha are said to be attainable through this sutra, but one must not listen to the teachings without practicing them. So it likens this in the next chapter. If you listen to the teachings but you don't practice them, it's like receiving instructions from a doctor to take medicine, but never taking the medicine. So you have one step, hearing the Dharma, but if you don't practice it, then you're not going to achieve the results of the practice. So not only must you hear the teachings, but you have to practice them. And so in order to have the motivation to practice, you have to have faith, you have to have devotion, you have to have Śraddhā and Prasāda. So thus one must cultivate faith and devotion in praising the Buddha and cultivating the practice of Samādhi. And faith, devotion, these are things which a lot of people, particularly Western Buddhists, might be averse to, but it is the reason why you sit down to practice. It's the reason why you sit down to meditate. It's the reason why you make progress on the path, because you have that, you could say, you have that fire under your feet, that motivation, because you believe, you may not know for sure, but you believe the Buddha is right in his teachings, that samsara is a thing, that karma is real, and that if you don't practice, you're going to stay in samsara. And then the third is to eliminate defilements and right conduct. And this is related to number 5, purifying karma and overcoming obstacles. But in order to progress, you have to reduce the mental defilements. So this is more cognitive defilements. And so in chapter 4, Samādhi, one comes to be able to attain Samādhi by eliminating mental defilements and embracing virtues like correct conduct and renunciation. Just as receiving medicine without taking it, if one gets the teachings but does not practice them, one will not progress. So you have to practice, you have to reduce the mental defilements in order to make progress on the path. And then in the 4th stage, one must cultivate renunciation. So in the chapter on Goshadatta, the advanced practitioner must forsake worldly ties and home, just like King Mahābala, who renounced home after learning that making grand offerings to Buddha Goshadatta was inferior to putting the teachings into action. He eventually became the Buddha Gyanashura, and his disciples became Buddhas called Dhrudashura. So we have an example from a past life of someone who did just that. So a king who renounced and eventually became a Buddha. So one has to have renunciation to make progress. So this is one theme that I'll talk about later, is it seems like the audience of the sutra is not necessarily lay people, though lay people can practice the Dharma. Really, the audience is mainly monastic, right? So it's talking about people who are really committed to full-time renunciation and serious practice. The 5th step is purifying karma and overcoming obstacles. So in the chapter on cultivating the Samādhi, making offerings without notions of giver or receiver, dedicating the merit to awakening, and realizing the absence of arising and ceasing shields one from Māras. So overcoming obstacles to Samādhi thus by accumulating merit and purifying karma. So one has to overcome external obstacles, not just internal defilements, by practicing correctly. So by engaging in giving without mental attachment, one accumulates the ultimate kind of merit, which leads one to be free from the assaults of Māras. So going back to the overall structure, that's the teaching on preliminary or preparatory practices for achieving the Samādhi. Okay, and then going on to section 2, that section 2 is preliminary superior attainments that come from those preparatory practices. So all of those preparatory practices that were discussed in part 1, we see what the attainments are from those practices in part 2. So this is 3 subdivisions. The first is attaining patience. So in the chapter on the attainment of patience, it instructs bodhisattvas to master 3 kinds of patience. 1, upholding Dharma with mastery of the sutras without anger or doubt. 2, maintaining constant meditation and attaining superior powers. And 3, seeing other worlds, teaching others, receiving prophecies, but remaining unaffected by praise or blame due to understanding emptiness. So these are 3 kinds of patience that go just beyond not having anger or doubt. That's within number 1. But similar to how Samādhi has this polyvalent grand meaning, in this chapter, patience also has this deeper meaning, which goes to actually understanding emptiness. And in other sutras, like the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, this is referred to patience at the non-arising of all dharmas. So this is a kind of supramundane kind of patience. One is able to practice meditation constantly without getting weary, and thereby attain superior powers. And so this is a kind of patience which is able to endure the reality of the world, which would upset our attachments that keep us bound to samsara. Then in in part 2 or subdivision 2, it's that one realizes emptiness and thereby overcomes suffering. And so in chapter 8 on Buddha Abhava Samudgata, grasp the wisdom of the non-existence of dharmas, of both self and phenomena, to eliminate desire and thus suffering. Just like Buddha Abhava Samudgata, who proclaimed the non-existence of all dharmas upon arising, echoed by worldly sounds, and his disciple Prince Mahakaruna Chintan, who attained Buddhahood as Suvichinti Tarta. So again, this is a supramundane kind of attainment that one gets from preparatory practices. So one comes to have the wisdom of how dharmas don't have inherent existence, either of a self, of personhood, or phenomena, so all dharmas. And one eliminates desire, and thereby one also eliminates suffering. And then we have the example of this Buddha and his disciple who did just that. And then the third is harmonize emptiness with conventional truth for compassionate conduct. So this is expressed in chapter 9, the patience of the profound Dharma. So in this chapter, it teaches view all dharmas as illusory, realizing profound patience, while harmonizing ultimate and relative truth, being able to balance wisdom with compassionate conduct. So this is coming to have supramundane realization of all dharmas as illusory. And then having the ability to also harmonize the ultimate and relative. So not only does one see the true nature of all dharmas, that all things are fundamentally empty and illusory, but one is still able to act in the world despite having that kind of supramundane realization. One is still able to see how all dharmas have as their nature, or that all dharmas have nothing underlying their true nature, and yet sentient beings who are suffering within samsara because of grasping to the illusory nature of all dharmas still need to be saved. And so one still combines or balances that wisdom that all dharmas lack inherent existence, with compassionate motivation. And so this connects to bodhicitta as well. So that was section 2, the superior attainments. And then in section 3, we have Candraprabha's invitation to have the samadhi taught and what its benefits will be. So 1 is the foundations, and 2 are the benefits of that foundation. Once one has those foundations, essentially, once one is a superior bodhisattva, possibly even on the bodhisattva stages, then one is ready to attain the samadhi. But in order for the samadhi to be attained, it has to be taught. And for it to be taught, someone has to invite the Buddha to teach it. And so in section 3, Candraprabha invites the Buddha to teach the samadhi. And we also learn what its benefits will be. So this section has 5 subdivisions. The first is receiving blessings from the Buddha. So in the chapter on the entry into the city, Candraprabha invites the Buddha into his house for alms, and the Buddha transforms the city and honors all, bestowing blessings on Candraprabha, allowing him to attain various samadhis and blessings. In section 2 of this subsection, we have the section on upholding the sutra, which in chapter 11, becoming an upholder of the sutra, it teaches that understanding the Dharma, as in this sutra, the Samadhi, Candrapradīpasamādhi Sūtra, is equal to making offerings to countless Buddhas. The most important thing is understanding the Dharma and teaching it to others, which protects oneself from falling into the evil paths. So this is referring to becoming yourself an upholder of the sutra. So you have to understand the Dharma. So if you understand the Dharma, it's equal, or in some sutras it even says it's even better than making offerings to countless Buddhas. And so the most important thing is to, after you understand the Dharma, is to understand it and teach it to others. And then the third division in this section is the nature and practice of the samadhi. So in chapter 12, the training according to the samadhi teaches, realize that all dharmas are empty, beyond words and names, that without attachment one overcomes Māras. And this chapter describes the ineffability of the samadhi, which ultimately has a single meaning. And then chapter 13, the teaching of the samadhi. Cultivating the samadhi involves developing a mind of equality towards all in non-conceptual natural observation, meditating in secluded places, attaining wisdom, and embodying the Buddha's conduct. And as a result of attaining the samadhi, one will become immune to all harm. And then in section 4 on the Buddha's smile and Candraprabha's prophecy, the chapter on the Buddha's smile, praising the Buddha, Candraprabha offers to him, and then the Buddha smiles, and Maitreya asks why. And then in the chapter on the elucidation of the Buddha's smile, the Buddha said that he smiled because as a result of Candraprabha's offerings and praises, he knows that Candraprabha will, in the future, be praised by all the world. After encountering countless Buddhas, he will himself become a Buddha. And then in the section on worldly benefits of the samadhi, it says that in the chapter on the past, in the distant past, the Buddha, as Prince Mati, overcame illness by practicing this samadhi, which also makes one impervious to slander. So we see some benefits of the samadhi, but we also have Candraprabha requesting that the samadhi be taught. And then number 4 is the core teaching section, the samadhi itself. So this section, as you can see, it's quite long, 17 to 39. And we can understand it as having 6 subsections, each with further subsections. So the first is how to attain the samadhi, then honoring the sutra / samadhi, relying on the good friend, cultivating in accord with the Dharma, not for honor or gain, and the nature of the Tathagata. Then after that, we have a series of chapters on bodhisattva conduct, which are like exemplars of people who have attained the samadhi and honor the samadhi. So first, how do you attain the samadhi? So in this chapter, called The Entranceway to the Samadhi that is taught by many Buddhas, the setting returns to Vulture's Peak after going to Candraprabha's house. Earlier, the Buddha taught this samadhi as being the way to attain Buddhahood. But now, he teaches the method for attaining the samadhi directly. It is, in brief, through patience, morality, renunciation, and yearning for the Dharma. And it is exemplified by King Shiribala, who renounces his throne to practice this samadhi. Okay. So it seems very basic, but actually, if we have a look at this practice, patience, morality, renunciation, and yearning for the Dharma, what this is really talking about is the whole Bodhisattva path. And it's also talking about bodhicitta. What it's saying is, in effect, if one is practicing the Bodhisattva path and one attains Buddhahood, that is how you attain the samadhi, right? So it is the Bodhisattva path itself. And then section 2, honoring the sutra / samadhi. So here we see the identification, like I mentioned in the first video, of the samadhi with the sutra itself. So there's a conflation between the sutra and the term samadhi. So the attainment is the text, because by studying the text, by honoring the text, one comes to attain what the text teaches, which is the samadhi itself. So in the section on upholding the samadhi, we have the entrustment of the samadhi. So it teaches upholding the sutra results in perfected merit, protection, wisdom, and eloquence. So there's 4 things. And those who maintain virtuous conduct and devotion to the sutra will be born in Amitabha's land of bliss. So here's another very important feature. So those who uphold this sutra, not only do they gain merit, protection, wisdom, and eloquence, but they'll be born in Amitabha's pure land. So in effect, the Samadhi Raja Sutra, or Candrapradīpasamādhi Sutra, is a kind of Pure Land Sutra, but it teaches birth in the Pure Land through what is taught in the larger Sukhavati Vyuha, the larger Sutra of the Buddha of Infinite Life, as a practice of the 19th vow. So by engaging in wholesome deeds, practicing the Mahayana, reciting Mahayana Sutras, and worshiping Mahayana Sutras, one can be born in the Pure Land. And then in the second division, believing in the Sutra, in the chapter on the teachings of the inconceivable Dharma of Buddhas, it says, beings should inquire about and have faith in the Sutra without fear, realizing the vastness of the Dharma in every pore, encompassing all realms, and awakening to the Dharma like from a dream. So one has to have faith. And again, we talked about how faith is really the motivation to practice the Dharma. It's a thing that once you have it, you know for sure that you're going to attain awakening. It's an assurance of irreversibility from the attainment of Buddhahood. Okay, and then the next step, or the next factor on attaining the samadhi, is to rely on the good friend. So in the chapter on Introductory Vajraja, one should rely on good friends and teachers without distractions, like Buddha Indraketu Vajraja, who taught that all dharmas are like the moon and water, and this maintains compassionate bodhicitta. Okay. So relying on good friends and teachers, usually good friends refers to the Buddha or to a Dharma friend, someone who encourages you to practice the Dharma. Right? So it's not just a buddy who you go drinking with. It's someone who encourages you and practices the Dharma together with you, studies the Dharma with you. And then the fourth division, cultivating in accord with the Dharma, not for honor or gain, that refers to chapter 21, the chapter in the past, or the chapter the past. So in this chapter, in a past life, Dipankara and Shakyamuni Buddhas, as 2 young monks, inspired a king to protect the Dharma, but unvirtuous monks plot to kill the 2. But the Devas defend them, and the conspirators fall into hell. So this sounds like, in this summary, it sounds very terse. But what this is saying is one who protects the Dharma with faith and truly wants to cultivate in accord with the Dharma without regard for honor or gain will themselves be protected. But if one's looking for fame, if one's looking for honor, that's not in accord with the spirit of the Dharma. And then fifth is the nature of the Tathagata. So this is the one that talks a bit about some of the qualities of what one attains, what one has when one realizes the Samadhi, which you could say is Buddhahood itself, but also the whole Bodhisattva path. So number one, the Dharma body. So chapters 22 to 23, the teaching on the body and the Tathagata's body. The Buddha's true body is the Dharma body, beyond physical characteristics, and seen through Samadhi, seen through this Samadhi. The Buddha's wisdom and the Dharma body are boundless. Thus, bodhisattvas should transcend attachment to physicality and cultivate a deep understanding of the Dharma. So this touches on both the attainment and some of the things that a bodhisattva should do to come to realize that attainment, that realization that the Dharma body is boundless, and as is the Buddha's wisdom. And then in part two, it's on the qualities of the Tathagata. So the chapter is called the Inapprehensible Tathagata. The qualities of the Bodhisattva and Tathagata are inapprehensible and unfathomable. Still, they can be analyzed in the fourfold manner discussed on an earlier slide. In fact, in the previous video, and fit into the categories of correct discrimination of dharmas, meanings, definitive words, and courageous eloquence. Within each, they have an ultimately pure nature, but as far as one can apprehend something, that is something conditioned to which one must not get attached. So when we talk about the qualities of a Buddha, there are lots of things that we can say, all positive things, great things, but we must also understand, as long as we're apprehending something, as long as we have a conception or a calculation of some quality or nature, we're not really seeing the true thing. We're just seeing a semblance of the true thing. And then the third is the form and formlessness of the Buddha. So in chapter 25 on engaging in discernment, it says, one perceives the Buddha through form, for example, in person, images, or visualization. But one must understand that form and non-form are inseparable. Form and bodhi are inseparable. That is to say, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So on the one hand, what we learn from this is not only that that we should not be attached to the form of the Buddha, like an image of the Buddha or a visualization of the Buddha, but on the other hand, we can realize, as the Contemplation Sutra teaches, that when one visualizes or sees the Buddha, that mind is the Buddha, right? So we are actually connecting to the nature of the Buddha through that image, right? By seeing that form. So it's not. And usually people fixate on the emptiness aspect of this idea. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So they usually focus on the first part, form is emptiness. But emptiness is also form. So we can access the ultimate through skillful means that the Buddha manifests in form. So when we see an image of the Buddha, even when we see syllables, sacred syllables in Sanskrit, like the letter A or the letter Hum, Hri, and other sacred syllables that we get in esoteric Buddhism, these are ways through which we can access and directly connect to emptiness itself. But only so long as we continue to have this non-dual understanding. So this is engaging in discernment. And then finally, the teachings on bodhisattva conduct. So all of these are, number one is specifically how to attain the Samadhi, honoring the Samadhi, but we should understand that actually everything that came before is actually the nature of the Samadhi itself. They are all what the Samadhi is. So what is the Samadhi? It's the path. It's the way to attain it itself. It's It's what one honors in practicing the Dharma. It's the reliance on the good friend, like the Buddha says in the Nikayas. The entirety of the path is the good friend, right? And cultivation in accord with the Dharma is the Samadhi, is Buddhahood itself, not thinking about honor or gain. So you have to have it's the bodhicitta motivation. And it is the nature of the Tathagata which underlies your nature. It is form is emptiness, emptiness is form. It is that non-duality and that absence of inherent existence, which we come to realize through practicing the Mahayana Dharma. Okay, and then section 6 on the Bodhisattva conduct is itself to the Samadhi. So Bodhisattva conduct is the Samadhi. So Bodhisattvas in their practice embody the Samadhi. They come to put the Samadhi into a form that can be that can be interacted with and touched by all beings. So how does one engage in Bodhisattva conduct according to the Samadhi Raja? Well, first, rejoicing in others' merits is subsection 1. Then the 6 perfections, 2. Then 3, urgent practice, practicing with a sense of urgency. Then the benefits of practice. So these are 4 sections which are about things that we should ideally be practicing or embodying. But then we have some exemplars, some interesting stories about people who practiced, one of which we already heard a little bit about from one of the other variants in the first video. And then number 6, the final encouragement to maintain morality. So let's have a look first at rejoicing in others' merits. So in the chapter on rejoicing, to cultivate the Samadhi, a bodhisattva must regard all beings as one's relatives. Thus, one should rejoice in others' merits, always helping them to generate merit and embrace right views. So rejoicing in others' merits and always helping them to generate merit and embrace right views. Usually we always think about, well, what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? And if we do something right, then we feel happy. We rejoice in ourselves. But usually we don't think so much about what others are doing. But if we regard all beings as one's relatives, if you think about all beings as like as if they were your children, when they do good, you feel happy because you see, my child is actually making progress. They're growing up to be an adult, to be able to function in the world well. So as long as we see other beings doing good deeds and practicing closer towards awakening, we start to feel a sense of you could say pride. I mean, maybe pride is not the right word in a Buddhist context, but we start to see them from a positive perspective. We start to feel joy at that. And so therefore we should rejoice and help them if we can to generate merit and embrace right views. So if we see that they're interested in the Dharma, they're making some progress, but maybe they have the wrong understanding of something, try to do what you can to skillfully guide them to the right understanding. And then the 6 perfections. So here we see the 6 perfections taught across 3 chapters. So we see 2 chapters on generosity and morality, and the rest are taught in the chapter on 10 benefits. So the benefit of generosity chapter teaches that one should not be negligent in cultivating the 6 perfections. The first, giving, has 10 benefits, including overcoming stinginess, gaining wealth, being loved by the Sangha, and becoming close to spiritual friends. So this is all of these are things which probably you can understand. Becoming close to spiritual friends is something that helps you with generosity. It allows you to have someone to give offerings to, being loved by the Sangha, because you can offer to them. But gaining wealth is also something that's mentioned. If you think about some of the great donors in Buddhist history, many of them are kings or wealthy merchants like Anathapindada. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be wealthy from a Buddhist perspective, because you can give that wealth away. So, it's a really unique perspective on wealth. So it's not pro Buddhism is not necessarily pro poverty, but if you have wealth, it means you're able to help others better. But many people who have wealth themselves don't really use wealth for those purposes. They continue to use it to make themselves richer, which from the Buddhist perspective would be a wrong use of wealth, or it would be a misuse. Not necessarily wrong, but it's going to waste. Because you can't take wealth with you into your next life. And then morality. And so in the chapter on the teaching on correct conduct, it continues that there are 10 benefits of pure morality, including fulfilling omniscience, training as the Buddha did, maintaining non-regressing vows, and achieving superior samadhi. And then in the chapter on 10 benefits, there are also sets of 10 benefits to the perfections of patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom. Besides accumulating supernormal powers, one also attains the treasuries of the Buddha, Dharma, and wisdom. So those are the 6 perfections. The third aspect is on urgent practice. So in the chapter on Tejaguna Raja Buddha was revered by King Druddhadatta, who was Shakyamuni Buddha in a past life. That Buddha taught the king, the illusoriness of all dharmas, karma, and the practice of this samadhi. After cultivating this samadhi extremely diligently and urgently, King Druddhadatta gained great rewards and divine protection. And those who do so in the same way will be born in Amitabha's pure land. So as an example of bodhisattva conduct, we have King Druddhadatta's deeds from cultivating, but we also have again this reiteration that if you practice in accord with the samadhi, you do good deeds. One of the benefits is that you'll be born in Amitabha's pure land, and that kind of takes care of the rest of the path, because you'll be in a Buddha land. And then the benefits of practice, chapters 31 to 33. So this section has 2 subsections: relative benefits, and this is in the chapter on benefits. So relative benefits refers to wisdom, equanimity, boundless merit, and respect. So this is you could say benefits that we can perceive in the world, worldly benefits. Wisdom is, of course, something that connects to the ultimate, but this is really referring to wisdom in terms of how to engage in the world, equanimity in regard to things that we experience, etc. But ultimate benefits are going into the supramundane level. So in the chapter on the teaching on the nature of all dharmas, it says, practicing this samadhi results in attaining ultimate wisdom, discipline, and supernormal abilities, the ability to visit other Buddhas, endurance without anger, and boundless compassion. One will embody a life of tranquil generosity, patience, and an understanding of emptiness. So this is going beyond just a worldly, everyday, relative benefit. This is an ultimate kind of benefit, the benefit which is the kind of benefit that a bodhisattva incurs as they progress along the bodhisattva path. And then in chapter 33 on the benefits of possessing the sutra, it says, by realizing emptiness through 5 unconditioned aggregates of discipline, samadhi, wisdom, total liberation, and perceiving the liberated state of wisdom, and practicing non-attachment with understanding of no self, one will attain mastery over mind and body, resulting in great merit and ultimately liberation. So this is really the ultimate benefit, right? So you become a Buddha. But it also adds, through faith, one can also attain birth in Amitabha's Pure Land, swiftly attaining liberation there. So this is the 3rd time we've seen reference to Amitabha's Pure Land. And this time, rather than talking about worshiping the sutra or doing good deeds, we actually see faith mentioned. So this is indicating, at least implicitly, the 18th vow of Amitabha Buddha, that through faith alone, one can attain birth in the Pure Land. So everything that went before, this is very difficult, right? This is, attaining non-attachment, understanding no self, having mastery over mind and body. This is something that requires you to be a sage, right? This requires you to be an advanced, super adept bodhisattva who can meditate at a super mundane level, ultimate level, realizing emptiness. Now, that is the ideal, right? That is what we all should be aiming for. But if we're being realistic and we see that we're probably not going to be able to do that, well, faith is also an alternative. If you just have faith in Amitabha Buddha and wish to go to his land, you will be born there. Right? So it's a swift path. It's an easy path. But of course, it doesn't conform to the ideal of the Bodhisattva path, but you fulfill the whole path by attaining birth in the Pure Land. And so birth in the Pure Land is also fulfilling the Candrapradīpasamādhi. It's also fulfilling the king of samadhis. It is the samadhi. And you could say the Nembutsu, the recitation of the Buddha's name, which is a way of recalling through faith Amitabha Buddha, which is the method of the 18th vow, that is often referred to as the Nembutsu Samadhi. And so we could also say the Nembutsu Samadhi, the recitation of the Buddha's name, Samadhi, is also the Candrapradipa Samadhi, the Samadhi that the sutra is teaching. So it's the whole path to Buddhahood in one practice, in one realization, that of faith. But yeah, going back to the path of sages, we get to exemplars of practices. So some of these super mundane, really exemplary bodhisattvas who fulfilled the bodhisattva path through these kinds of conduct. So there are three exemplars. The first is Kshemadatta. So Kshemadatta Bhikshu, who was Shakyamuni Buddha in a past life, engaged in self-sacrifice by setting his arm alight. Inspired by this, King Sri Ghosha and his assembly leapt from their pavilion and were saved by devas, touched by their devotion. So this is a narrative that we actually see a lot of bodhisattvas doing in past lives. So we see this also in a past life story in the Lotus Sutra and various other sutras. This is an example of someone who has absolutely no attachment to themselves, right? So they wish to make an offering to the Buddhas of light, set themselves alight. This absolute non-attachment, absolute devotion. But at the end of the day, everyone is restored back to normal because the devas are watching over them and the devas are touched by their devotion, and because everyone is super mundane, right? So we have to keep this in mind. This is not saying that we, tomorrow should go out and jump from our pavilions, jump from our balconies or what have you, because we have devotion. Because in that case, they were being watched over by the devas, but we probably are not quite at that level. So although we may have faith that we are, I would be, I would be responsible if I were to say this is something that we should do. This is an exemplar. This is an example of a supramundane being, or a set of supramundane beings. Okay. And then the next is another supramundane being who we heard a little bit about earlier, is Princess Gyanavati. So Princess Gyanavati sacrificed her flesh and blood to cure Bhutamati Bhikshu. So again, as you heard earlier, and you should read it in the sutra for the full story, but Bhutamati Bhikshu needed the blood of a virgin. And the only one who was available, who also was willing, happened to be a bodhisattva, who was Princess Gyanavati. So she sacrificed her own flesh and blood to cure this Bhikshu. And then after doing that, Gyanavati reflects on impermanence and vows to attain Buddhahood. And so in this way, one should protect the Dharma teachers rather than neglect them. So it's also a teaching on devotion to the teachers. Now, it's very hard to find teachers that you would have that kind of devotion towards in this world. So I would also be a bit negligent if I were to recommend to you to do this for your teachers. Sacrifice your own flesh and blood if they say, well, I need the blood of a virgin, or a human, like we saw in the alternative version. just the flesh and blood of a human. Well, there are people out there who you should be careful of in terms of teachers. And this is a supernormal exemplar, right? This is a supernormal exemplar of bodhisattvas who ultimately they get better, after doing this. They don't die as a result. So this is something which probably is not a category that we fit into. Probably if we go back to here, we probably fit into this section here. Through faith, one can also attain rebirth or birth in Amitabha's Pure Land. So it's worth keeping that in mind, in the back of one's mind when one sees these exemplars. And then the third exemplar is Supushpachandra. So King Śraddhā brutally executed the Dharma teacher Supushpachandra, but he was able to atone by revering the Dharma and building stupas. Ultimately, upholding precepts, practicing dharani, and protecting the teachings leads to swift progress toward Buddhahood without encountering such suffering. So, so here's another example of, you could say, supernormal activities by supernormal beings in past lives, but also I think this is a great story of redemption. And I think Buddhist sutras offer redemption on a scale that we don't really see in other religions. So anybody, really, no matter how evil one becomes, or no matter how terrible the deeds one commits, you really are, ultimately, you are redeemable at the end of the day. But you do have to repent, really. You have to have a turning about of mind, turning about of heart. So in this case, he upholds precepts, practices dharani, and protects the teachings. So he continues to make swift progress toward Buddhahood. So of course, in these stories, I'm leaving out a lot of details because this video is already running quite long, and I can't go into all of them. But I have much longer summaries on my website, which you can check out. But I also recommend reading the sutra itself because they're really fantastic stories. They're very, very profound and very, very touching. And then the final encouragement to maintain morality, chapters 37 to 39. So this section has 3 subsections. The aggregate of morality. So the teaching on the aggregate of morality says, a bodhisattva should uphold the pure aggregate of morality, serve as a guardian of the Dharma, and practice the supreme Samādhi to accumulate vast merit and wisdom, benefiting all beings. By doing so, they swiftly attain Bodhi, guide others towards liberation, and protect the Dharma with unwavering resolve. Okay. So uphold morality, and by doing so, one attains all sorts of benefits, all the way up to Bodhi. Then Yashaprabha, as an exemplar of morality. The Buddha teaches the past life story of Yashaprabha, who was Shakyamuni in his own past life, who was persecuted by jealous bhikshus, to emphasize that through patience, generosity, and the realization of emptiness, one can uphold the Dharma even amidst adversity. The Buddha also encourages transcending worldly attachments, cultivating virtues like compassion and loving kindness, and realizing that all dharmas are like illusions. Okay. And then finally, the restraint of body, speech, and mind. This chapter teaches that bodhisattvas must perfect bodily, verbal, and mental restraint to gain unobstructed wisdom and full understanding and full awakening. By maintaining pure karma, one will see the 3 realms as illusory, culminating in non-discursive Samādhi. So it's a promise that if one upholds purity in body, speech, and mind, one will eventually attain the Samādhi. Okay, so that's the final encouragement to morality. And then the sutra concludes with the propagation section. So most Mahayana sutras end with one of these. So this teaches that, chapter called Conclusion, it says, in a boundless display of cosmic quakes and celestial offerings, the Buddha extols the profound Vaipulya Dharma, leading innumerable beings to various levels of awakening, and after naming it, the entry into great compassion. I think I mentioned that earlier as one of the alternative titles of the sutra. And the Samādhi of the equality of the essential nature of all dharmas, he instructs Ananda to preserve and disseminate it, inspiring universal joy. So that's a full synopsis of the sutra. Now, let's go into a kind of synthesis of the ideas that the sutra taught. So we touched on some of these as we went through, but here I'll explain a little bit in a little bit more detail what its approaches are to various different concepts. So first of all, shunyata and illusoriness. The sutra teaches the wisdom of the non-existence of dharmas to eliminate desire and suffering. So if you understand that dharmas fundamentally lack self-existence, self-nature, or svabhava, this is a method. This is a key way, particularly in as it connects to pragyaparamita practice and also Mahamudra based on Madhyamaka thought. This is how these forms of Mahayana Buddhism teach one to overcome desire and suffering. So through understanding the true nature of things, one can overcome suffering. While understanding thus that phenomena are like illusions, dreams, or the reflection of the moon and water, which are very common analogies in Buddhist texts, one must harmonize this with conventional reality, allowing one to still engage in compassionate conduct in the world. So not only understanding that all things are illusory, but being able to balance that with compassion, so one is still able to help others. Right? So this is essential to the Bodhisattva path. This freedom from characteristics and understanding of emptiness is the nature of the Buddha's Dharmakaya, the Buddha's Dharma body, and is realized through the Samādhi of this sutra. But one must still understand that form and formlessness are inseparable. Okay? So we come to realize the true nature of the Buddha, we come to realize the Buddha's true body through understanding emptiness. But one has to bear in mind this inseparability of form and formlessness. This allows one not only to not get attached to form, but also to understand how, from the formless perspective or from the perspective of emptiness, one can use form to manifest and help other beings. Right? So balancing emptiness and form from a non-dual perspective without prioritizing one over the other is really essential. And I think most Buddhists who learn about pragyaparamita, perfection of wisdom, they usually overemphasize the emptiness aspect and forget the form, forget that emptiness is also form, right? So it's important to bear both in mind. Next, Sutra Mahamudra reading of the Sutra Mahamudra reading and chapter 33. So prior analysis of the sutra, both classical and recent, has focused on its heavy emphasis on emptiness, and this is why it was taken up so heavily in the Sutra Mahamudra tradition. Maitripa, in his Tattvadashika, and his disciple Sahajavajra, in his Tattvadashika, describe a path superior to the standard Sutra Mahayana path, and one that does not involve initiation or the stages of tantric practice. So this is what we would refer to as Sutra Mahamudra. So we have Tantra Mahamudra, but also Sutra Mahamudra. So Tantra Mahamudra would be one that relies upon, you also have to have initiations, and it connects to tantric practices and the tantric path. Dzogchen is fairly similar. You have to have initiations, and it connects to the tantric path. But Sutra Mahamudra is one that allows one to have the same realizations of the full Mahamudra path, but it doesn't require initiation. To support this, they rely on a specific set of verses. Chapter 33 in the Chinese and also in the Tibetan, it's chapter 33, at least the Chinese that I translated. where I put the chapter numbers from the Tibetan and chapter 32 in the Sanskrit. So these verses are used to demonstrate that all concepts or characteristic signs, which in Sanskrit is nimitta and sangya, must be realized as unarisen and pure. So this is a classic way of understanding things, which one gets from practicing Mahamudra. So this became a key tenet of the Mahamudra style path and eventually shaped the Tibetan Sutra Mahamudra tradition, which in turn is the basis of Trungpa Rinpoche's 2004 commentary from the Kagyu perspective. And then the third idea of the sutra, major idea, is the king of samadhis itself, or the Samadhi Raja, which the sutra calls the samadhi of the equality and non-discrimination of all dharmas, which is the goal of the sutra. This is a mind of equality towards all beings through non-conceptual, natural observation. So it's a natural, equanimous observation. You see things as they are. You don't change things, you don't add things. You see them as they are. They're empty. They're empty of inherent existence. And they're also ultimate, we see that the samadhi and what it realizes is ultimately ineffable. It's something beyond words and names, so you can't describe it. It's non-conceptual. And it's the true nature of things. And to retain the samadhi, one must practice the path, the conventional bodhisattva path that we understand from studying the Dharma. So one must practice patience, morality, renunciation, and yearning for the Dharma. And it is cultivated in secluded places to attain and embody the Buddha's conduct. So it's a conventional understanding of the practicing the Mahayana path, but it's also, by and large, a monastic path. It's more on the ascetic side, at least what this sutra teaches. But it has that connection to the world through various other ideas that we have reviewed. Attaining this samadhi leads to unobstructed wisdom, immunity from all harm, and the ability to see the three realms as illusory. Okay, so there are lots of benefits all the way up to, it is full Buddhahood. But these are benefits that are highlighted. And then the Bodhisattva path. So the path, according to this sutra, and every sutra which teaches the Bodhisattva path has a bit of a different spin on what it emphasizes. But according to this sutra, the path begins with cultivating an equanimous mind towards all beings, seeing them as one's own relatives. This forms the basis for boundless compassion, balanced with the realization of emptiness. The sutra details the 10 benefits for each of the 6 perfections, or paramitas: generosity, morality, patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom. It also details 3 specific types of patience: upholding the Dharma without anger, maintaining constant meditation, and remaining unaffected by praise or blame through an understanding of emptiness. The key theme is the need for practitioners to make a sincere confession, to forsake worldly ties and home. So again, the monastic, the more renouncer orientation of the sutra, and to practice with extreme diligence and urgency, as exemplified by King Dridadatta. Unlike other Mahayana sutras, this sutra usually addresses its implied audience simply as sons of good family, rather than including women. It doesn't say daughters of good family much. So this could be a criticism of the sutra from a feminist perspective, and is oriented towards male ascetic monks or dutta practitioners. Despite this, it has stories of female protagonists, a few that we reviewed. And it's worth noting that the final quarter of the sutra is largely given over to exemplars of bodhisattva conduct, including female practitioners. So in that respect, you could say it has that redemptive quality, that although it seems to not address women in its direct discourse dialogue, it uses examples of women who have attained the samadhi. So it's not saying that women can't attain the samadhi, but it seems to be it seems to be a sutra which has that male milieu in mind, maybe as a target audience. And then finally, devotion and what's called the Buddha-nusmṛti. So Buddha-nusmṛti refers to recollection of the Buddha, or concentration on the Buddha in some traditions. But in East Asian Buddhism, Buddha-nusmṛti, or recollection of the Buddha, is usually understood as reciting the Buddha's name. And it doesn't have to be Amitabha Buddha. It can be any Buddha, including Shakyamuni Buddha. So a core practice in this sutra is cultivating faith and devotion through praising the Buddha's qualities. And this is directly linked to cultivating the practice of Samādhi. One must rely on good friends and teachers, Kalyana Mitra, without distraction, to maintain compassionate bodhicitta. And one should protect and not neglect Dharma teachers. Then simply hearing the teachings is not enough. One must put them into practice. Upholding and teaching the sutra is presented as an act of supreme merit, equal to making offerings to countless Buddhas and a source of divine protection. So not only hearing, but also practicing the sutra, and then also upholding it and teaching it. And even it's even equal to making offerings to countless Buddhas. And then finally, and the thing that I kind of encouraged people to pay more attention to towards the end of my synopsis is that for those who practice the Samādhi with faith, the sutra promises rebirth in Amitabha's land of bliss, Sukhavati, where liberation can be swiftly attained. In fact, it also says even just having faith allows one to be born in Amitabha's land of bliss. So it teaches practices that are in accord with a variety of Amitabha's vows related to birth in the Pure Land. And then regarding other Samādhi literature, the redactors clearly had familiarity with the Pratyutpana text and practices. So this is something which is in the back of the mind, I think, of people who are redacting the sutra. And as you read through it, if you have read the Pratyutpana or the sutra on the Samādhi of all Buddha's presence, I think you will see a lot of similarities there. And so that's one that I'd like to study and maybe do a video about in the future as well. Okay, well, that's everything about the Samādhi Raja Sutra. So I hope that you found that to be fascinating. I personally think it's a very interesting sutra, which is neglected and not known more about. So yeah, I'm very happy to be able to share it with you. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below or send me an email. I'd be very happy to hear from you. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. I know it was quite a journey, quite a long video. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. Thank you for joining me through this whole presentation. And I hope to hear from you in future videos. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.